Avaliatividade e diretor do curso de mestrado em Linguística Aplicada e formação de professores de inglês como segunda língua. Entre suas inúmeras obras, ele é um dos editores da revista Functions of Language e as recentes publicações incluem Evaluation in Context, Introducing Functional Grammar, que vocês conhecem muito bem, System and Corpus, Exploring Connections, e artigos sobre tema, transitividade, sistema interpessoal e interação, metáfora gramatical, conjunção no texto e avaliatividade. Eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Leila Bárbara, que ela vai prosseguir na apresentação. A professora Leila Bárbara é a coordenadora brasileira do projeto SAL. Todos nós estamos no SAL por causa dela.
Bom dia, minha gente. Eu estou muito feliz de estar aqui. E é bom voltar para Brasília, né? Saudade. Se eu acabo vindo mais vezes, vamos ver. Estou com a minha boca está no alto, estou empolgadinha. Então, o professor é um dos melhores professores de sistêmica que eu tive essa honra. E o material dele realmente vale a pena ser lido, porque a gente tem uma clareza de exposição, vocês sabem, né? É uma clareza de exposição que vocês vão ver hoje. Eu espero que vocês não tenham muito problema com compreender, porque o inglês é muito padrão, então vai ser mais fácil. Agora, é uma honra muito grande a gente ter um jazz aqui. Isso feito só da... Como é que você chama isso?
Professora de pós-doc.
If there's any problems, yeah, I prefer not to have first of all, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to, what's her name? Edna, for inviting me and for the whole organisation, for making sure I could come. No thanks to British Airways who lost my suitcase. But at least it wasn't come. I am delighted to be back in Brazil and to be in Brasilia for the first time. Okay, I will be talking English. I'll try and keep it clear. I'll try not to talk too fast, but when I get interested, I get faster. So just say, please slow down, or don't be embarrassed to say, sorry, I didn't understand. Or to ask someone else. Naila will also translate. People is they are good at asking questions. So don't be embarrassed. If there's anything you want to say, what about this, or have you? I don't understand this, or can we do this? Then please ask me or comment. I don't mind. Okay, let's get on the way. First of all, I need my bits of paper. So you have basically. I hope you've all seen that at least and have copies, but it'll be on the screen if necessary. Okay, so we're looking at this morning at evaluation, appraisal from the SFL perspective, developed by Jim Martin and Peter White and colleagues especially. I think many of you know Martin and White 2005 and the rest of it. And this will be largely based on that, though in some places I don't follow the party line exactly. So there'll be small differences, but not much. Okay, well, evaluation, appraisal in their terms, is clearly very important. Think of all the things or the evaluations we have to do. We have to assess in different terms, in different, by different measures, different values, like what's going on around us. You're probably sitting there now thinking something like, well, I hope you're not thinking this is boring or this is difficult, but you will be evaluating what I'm doing, what you're doing now. Maybe you'll be thinking, I'm hungry, or I wish I'd had my coffee again. All the time we evaluate. As humans, we language. We use language all the time. And one of the main things we use it for is to evaluate, to think about what's happening to us, what we think about the world, whether we are happy or not that Dilma has been re-elected. I'm not going to ask you which you think, but all of that kind of thing, we are constantly evaluating, appraising. How do we do it? In the model, and I'm hoping this first part is familiar to much of you, so you can get used to me talking about it, because the ideas are not so new for you. How do we do it? How do we evaluate? There have been different systems of what values do we use. The very basic one is positive, negative. We like it, we don't like it, good or bad. That's underlies all of them. Different scholars, different researchers have used different, have set up different systems of, you know, what kinds of things what kind of values do we use? The people working in SFL, like Martin and White, like Jane Lemke, who did a very good paper, they sort of left this unfortunately, but he did another set of values. Monica Benderek has been working and adapting Martin and White. The advantage of these systems, we claim, is that they are linked to other areas of the language. So in philosophy, you'll find that some philosophers set up systems of values, but they're not tied to language. They are, as it were, invented from semantics. Now clearly we want semantics, meaning is important, but if we can link it to language as much as possible, it makes our analysis more systematic. That's the argument. As we'll see, it's not always easy. But what we do, okay? Well, basically, in this approach, we divide, or Martin White did argue about three different areas of evaluation. One, the central one, they call attitude, is what we generally think of as evaluation. Think about good and bad. I'll be looking at that in the first part now. They also look at what they call engagement, which really means if I evaluate, what else is going on? Do I allow for other people maybe to think differently? Do I present my evaluation as, that's it, no question? Okay. That's essentially what engagement is. We'll talk about it more later. So engagement is sort of how the evaluation gets put across. The third area, which I'm not going to look at very much at all because it's not an area I'm not interested in it actually, but I'm not very good at it. Sue Hood, who's married to Jim Martin, so she has to be on his side. She's done a lot of work. I think she's spoken in Brazil about it. What's she doing? Sue Hood. She's been to Argentina. Yeah. Anyway, that's graduation, which is basically upping and downing your evaluation. But I'm not going to look so much at that at all. Okay, within attitude then, the central part, what I think about things. Martin and White suggest that there are basically three continents. If you think of this as a map of our values, how we make sense of the world around us, then there are three major areas, the continents. The central one is affect, which is basically, in a way, the most natural. I like it, I don't like it. I like her, I don't like her. Typically with affect, we get the person who is evaluated, is mentioned. You'll see that's going to be important later. Okay? So the very basic thing is I like, dislike her. It's many other things as well. It's how we feel about, represented in terms of I'm here, the thing I'm evaluating is there, or person, and I have a feeling directed towards it, or sometimes I have a reaction to it. If you remember, going slightly sideways, to mental processes in transitivity, in processes of reaction or affection can often be two-way. I like it, it pleases me. Okay? But in both cases, we typically have the person feeling and the thing, with a link through, maybe through the verb, it doesn't have to be through the process, but that's the basic way. Okay? And you can see that in many ways, that is the most natural. We're talking about evaluation. It's my feeling about something or someone. So it's in some ways the most congruent in today's terms. That set of feelings then, in language, can get, Jim Martin's term is institutionalized. So represented not as this is a feeling going from me towards the thing, or an impact of the thing on me, but a quality of the thing or person. Okay? So if we go up to judgment, she is good or bad. Notice, typically, that does not include who is evaluated in the language. If I say it, it's clearly my evaluation. But the language, she is good or bad, has no reference to me. So the basic way is to represent the thing and give it a quality. The quality is my evaluation. Okay? There are two areas, two continents, which are divided basically, although as we'll see there are some problems, basically according to what kind of thing are we evaluating. If we're evaluating human beings, then it's judgment. Okay? Because clearly, human beings are the most important thing in our world. So we have a set of terms, a set of values which apply particularly when we're thinking about people. But we can also evaluate things around us. Appreciation, it is good or bad. Okay? So affect is basically emotional responses. Happiness, fear, liking. I'll leave the next bit there. Judgment is to do with very broad ethics, moral judgments about people. And appreciation is very broadly aesthetic. Our attitude towards things, products or natural things. So those are the three, as I say, continents of feeling. Any questions so far? As I say, it should be fairly. Or in Portuguese. Okay.
I would like to know if,
making a judgment on an institution. Yes. As we'll see, there are lots of these intermediate areas. One of them is institutions, which is quite common. The university, the government. Yes, I think we can either treat it as, we, when we evaluate, can treat it as a thing or as a person, as a group of people. So, government, university, you can often say they are subject to judgment because they are being treated as a group of people, if you like, a representative of. Another, we're already getting into different areas, but another interesting one is, for example, books. We'll see something which we're very used to the idea that this book considers. Hang on, a book has no brain; it cannot consider. But of course, the book is. Do you know the word surrogate? Surrogate stands in the place of. Yeah. So a book is a surrogate for the writer. Now, what happens then? It behaves like sometimes the processes, you have mental processes, or especially verbal processes. This chapter argues that. A chapter doesn't argue, the writer of the chapter argues, but the chapter represents things. And again, we have to say, okay, so when we have a chapter, a book, is it appreciation or judgment? That's even more difficult. But I think with institutions, I think very often we can say they are being treated as a group of humans. So we are evaluating them as humans. Okay. But not always. It's then the reader, or the speaker, can decide. You know that very often, with the government, for example, with a word like the government, I don't know if you do this in Portuguese, but certainly in English, you can either say the government is or the government are. You have a choice. Must be, isn't it? In English, you can treat it what they call collective nouns. You can treat it as a thing or a group. What about football team? The team is or the team are. The football team is or the football team are. In Portuguese? No. In English, yes. But Portuguese doesn't. Portuguese goes by the grammar. Very sensible. In English, we partly go by the grammar, but we also go by the semantics. So a team is a group of people. And institutions are, in terms of evaluations, can we have the choice? Okay. On the whole, I think institutions tend to get treated, in my experience, to judgment. So they're treated as groups of people. But, you know, it's like if you read, some of my students worked on university prospectuses. You know, when you go online, you type in the name of the university and it tells you, we are wonderful. Or the university is wonderful. Now, they have the choice. They can say, we are people, we are wonderful, or the university, I think, is wonderful. I'm sure that's true in Portuguese as well. You've got the choice. So, the way things get represented, and this is important for systemic functional linguistics always, the way things get represented is not determined by the outside world. It's determined by how I represent it in language. And typically, I have a choice. I can treat my car as a person. Okay? So I don't, but some people talk about my car, she, in Britain, ships traditionally were she. Boats. So, but that's simply, the speaker has the choice. How do I say? So, to come back where we started, for the institution, you have the choice, the speaker or writer has the choice. Typically for institutions, they're typically treated as groups of people, so judgment. But I can't say that's the answer, you have to look at the context. Okay? Right, now the other very important thing which Jim Martin and colleagues brought in, but it's also the thing that will give you headaches if you do any analysis, is the difference between very broadly inscribed and invoked. We'll look more at this in a moment, but inscribed means in my language, there is a bit of language which evaluates. I can point to it and say, this is evaluative. Invoked means I tell you something. The reason I am telling you that is in order to make you evaluate. But my language does not explicitly say this is evaluative. Okay? So he's a cruel child. Cruel, it's a word which means it's negative. If you call someone cruel, you are evaluating. No doubt. He's a child who likes tearing wings off butterflies. In most cultures, that will be he's not a nice child. In most cultures. But if you talk to other children, they might say, oh yes, I like that too. In other words, as we'll see, invoked appraisal is coercive. It makes the other person share your evaluation. Of course, you don't have to, but it pushes you that way. What's that? Okay, we'll see some more of that. But we also have to realise, in fact, even inscribed evaluation. Inscribed means it's there in the language, it's written into the language. Even that, traditionally, evaluation attitude was thought of, this is personal outpouring. So it's something focused on me. In SFL, you remember, we don't have a personal metafunction. We have an interpersonal metafunction. Anything things which traditionally were thought of as personal, like modality, This is, I am uncertain. I feel like this. Somehow I am pouring out my emotion into the world. No. In SFL we argue, why do we evaluate? Because we want a reaction. So all evaluation is interpersonal. It is an invitation to bond. Okay? Now, yeah. All traditionally, things like evaluation, people think of it as my feeling, just going out. In SFL, we think of it as I am telling you my feelings because I want a reaction. I want to, you know, when bond, this is to join, yeah, to set up a relationship.
SFL é ensino de inglês como língua estrangeira. Então, para estrangeiro,
Yeah, yes. Justice, I always like to be rude. Yes, sorry.
I have a question. I'm Aparecida, I'm new in this area, and I have a doubt, because when you say evaluation is a kind of interpersonal, you have a relationship, but it is easy for me to understand when we have an editorial in a newspaper, in a journal, but what about when you're talking about literature? You have the author and you have the characters. Sometimes the characters are speaking to the reader, and I don't know if I consider this interpersonal between the character and the reader, or the narrator and the reader.
Yeah, very good question. Literature behaves differently. Very often people say, oh, well, literature is just ordinary language used in a slightly different way. I think it's actually in many ways, very different. Because, of course, we'll see part of this later. Characters talk to each other, they have feelings. What I'm interested in is always the relationship between the text and the reader. I say the text because I want to get around the problem of writer versus narrator. And that's another problem. But the text and the reader, the text is designed to be evaluated by the reader. So that's the kind of evaluation I'm interested in. But you're right, there's other evaluation going on, kind of in the world of the novel or the play. And that's like at a secondary move. So if you imagine someone, a character in a novel, doing something bad, are we, the reader, meant to think that is bad, that was to evaluate? Or are we meant to think that is very well written by the author, so that I feel this is a bad character? In other words, is my reaction, I am judging the character, or I am appreciating the novel? And I think there's real problems there, and I think different people react differently. Some people, when they read a novel, treat it like the real world. I remember when I was teaching many years ago King Lear, Shakespeare, and some of my students would write essays saying Cordelia is very kind, she's a wonderful woman, she is how we should be. So they were judging her. I was trying to make my students think Shakespeare has written Cordelia in a very skillful way, created a character so that we feel this about her. So I wanted them to step back and to see it as John Sinclair talks about the artifact. We are meant to react as readers to the whole work of art. But there's real kind of issues. At that point, I think we need to go into reader response. See how readers are responding. So my answer is I have no answer, but it's a very good area. It's something I tend to avoid. I don't look at literature much for this purpose, precisely because it raises so many difficulties of deciding how am I meant to react. So, for example, to take an example, you know Milton's Paradise Lost. Yeah. In that, Satan, the devil, is a fantastic figure, very interesting, very complex. God is very boring. That's not what Milton wanted. Milton, the theologian. Milton, the artist, I think did something different. And what do we react to? Nowadays, readers think, wow, fascinating. Satan is a very complex character. So we react in that way. Are we meant to? Probably Milton would have been unhappy. But, so yes, you're right to raise that very important issue. But I don't think there's a way out of it. You have to just decide on each case. Okay? I say, that's not really an answer. It's just saying, yes, it's a very good question. Okay, so we've got those two ways. Inscribe and invoke. We'll come back to those here. And as I say, all evaluation is designed to evoke some kind of reaction. My brief answer, coming back to what you said, is a work of art as a whole is meant to evoke, to get a reaction. That's why the writer has written it. But it's a complex matter to know what exactly are we meant to react to. The classic case, of course, was, what's his name? Satanic Verses. Yeah, which caused, this is the novelist writing about Islam. Yes, but as a work of art, it's not Salman Rushdie, it's the creator, so you can play with it. Okay, the other thing to pick up on is that on the whole, we evaluate entities, things and people. So, London government is one of the greatest, most exciting experiments in democracy ever effected by man. I didn't like this, of course. I got it off the internet. So, London government is being evaluated. Okay. I won't go into the question of is that judgment or appreciation, because that's the government, of course. In vote, London is a city to shop in. Why are we told this? It's not just saying there are shops in London. It's saying London is the kind of place that if you're someone who likes shopping, you will like it. Notice, I'll come back to this, grammar is often crucial. X2 is often an evaluative structure. A city to, a person to. If you do a Google of asterisk 2, which is difficult, but you maybe do with wordsmith, you'll find that many cases, not all, many cases are in fact evaluated. One of the things that you find as you do more analysis is that phraseologies are often evaluative when you didn't expect it. So you think, oh, this one seems to be evaluative. Let me try in Google in the corpus. Yes, 60% of the cases I can find are evaluative. So that phraseology is typically used for evaluation. There's a lot of work to be done there, and also, of course, in Portuguese, I'm sure. But some of the most famous stories in the world are found in central London. Again, there's not very much. You've got most famous evaluated stores, but some of them are found in London. It's actually London that is being evaluated. We're being told something about London which is intended to make us feel better about it. We can also evaluate propositions, so this is not so common. So it's great to be in London again. The fact of being in London, clause, is being evaluated as great. And this structure in English, it is X to it is X that is inherently involved with, associated with evaluation of some kind. We'll see in a moment, not the least of the same. So, factors to consider. The kind of issue. Oh right, is it not plugged in? Oh right, so is it not plugged in? Sorry. Okay. Where do we go? Down there. Have we got a plug for it? At that point in the interaction, who is the source, and how openly is the source indicated. Okay. Now, with something like I like it, it's very obvious in the sources. This book is great. On the whole, it's fairly obvious. There are issues sometimes with, is someone else's evaluation being reported? And then, what's its status? If I tell you someone else likes a film, what's that doing between us? Okay? Is that still interaction? It's another issue. We might come back to that. Okay, what is the type of the three continents and subcontinents? What kind of evaluation is being represented and why? And related to that, they're almost the same, they're very closely related. What is being evaluated and what values are being drawn on? So we'll see examples of this when we come on to do some text analysis. But those are kind of general questions we need to keep in mind as we go through. Right. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this, so I wonder whether anybody's done any translation of these terms into Portuguese. These are some main subcategories. They are changing all the time. People are, particularly something like Monica Begerek has suggested changes. These are, if you like, the Old Testament, the standard version, as you'll find it in Martin Weiss. There are problems with it. Affect, they divide into realis and irrealis. So is the thing already there, or am I looking forward, looking out to something that doesn't yet exist? So if I'm afraid of it, I'm looking forward to what it might do to me. Okay? But it startled me. It's already there, and I'm reacting to it. Now, several people, particularly Monica, have pointed out that the divisions don't really work. For example, where do we put surprise? Surprise is definitely a feeling, but is it insecurity? Because surprise can be positive or negative. A nice surprise, birthday party, you know, or not, that's a surprise, I didn't expect that. And they've suggested various divisions. I haven't tried to put my own case here because at the moment I'm not sure. I think there are lots of issues going on. And every time I've read 3 or 4 different articles recently suggesting slightly different changes. And I'm not yet sure myself which one is most satisfactory. I don't think actually surprise works. Another thing that's been suggested is realis, irrealis. Actually, all of the categories can be seen as realis or irrealis. Another thing where I do disagree, and my examples actually, I show this though hidden. Martin and White give examples like, for example, unhappy, happiness, cheerful. Now, if you say he's cheerful, what's that doing? In terms of the interaction, he's cheerful. That's telling me about his feelings. But why am I telling you about his feelings? If, as I say, evaluation is to do with interaction between me, the speaker, and you, the addressee, how is he's cheerful telling you about that interaction? Martin and White don't really discuss this. My argument is that is not affect. It's emotion talk, using one of Monica's deadlifts. But why do I tell you that he is cheerful? Because I am judging him. In other words, standing for judgment. But that's a disagreement. I have an argument with Jim every time I meet him, and we never agree to disagree. We agree to no, we don't even agree to disagree. We just disagree. So, but that's why all my examples have something being evaluated, and they're also first person. Don't worry too much about that. In judgments, on the whole, those categories seem more robust. So, social esteem, social sanction, social esteem is doing slightly more, I don't say unimportant, but less serious problems. Social sanction is doing rather more serious. At one point, Jim, in a paper, chapter in 2000, says, if you have problems with social esteem, you may need to see a psychiatrist. If you have problems with social sanction, you may need to see a lawyer. So that's, or as he said, for Catholics, it's the difference between venial sins and mortal sins. Not quite that, but that's roughly. And that does seem to work. Again, there is a problem, I find, which is to do with, if you say someone is unlucky, she's very unlucky, that's clearly negative, but doesn't mean I am negatively judging her. No, there seems to be this problem that hasn't yet been sorted out about how I feel about it and what quality I'm ascribing. So someone who's unlucky, I probably feel sorry for them. I probably have a positive feeling, but is a negative suffix, so it ought to be negative. So particularly in judgment, there is this problem, this division, if you like, which hasn't been, well, I haven't worked out myself, between things which tell us this is a bad person or this is a good person, versus I feel positively towards it or I feel negatively towards it. And they can, mostly they're the same. If I say he's a liar, on the whole it doesn't mean that's good. It means he's bad and I feel bad towards him, I feel negative. So as I say, he's unlucky is the two coming apart. They become separate. So that's a problem in judgment. As I say, I'm not giving you answers here, I'm just saying watch out, you will find these problems when you do analysis. Appreciation, there, as Jim Marsden actually pointed out right from the beginning, we don't tend to change the kinds of judgments we make of people, because people are the same all over the world. Appreciation will often vary according to the field, the area of life that we are dealing with. So a student, a very good student, who I was her examiner for her PhD in Sweden, she looked at wine reviews of wine. And she found she had to establish subcategories or sometimes one main category which weren't in the model. But that's built in. Appreciation, you need to remember, if I'm not looking at a particular area that hasn't been examined yet, maybe I need to, probably subcategories, but I may need to divide it slightly differently. But there, the other big issue in there is the difference between reaction, impact and quality, and valuation. You'll notice my own way of dividing impact. Notice impact means, coming this way, is in English, particularly if it's an adjective, it doesn't work always, but if there's an adjective, an ing adjective, which comes from a verb, which would normally then be affect. So, it horrifies me, is affect. It's horrifying, I'm not there, so I will take that as impact. It's just a kind of rule of thumb for saying this is how I identify it. Because if you look in Martin White's on, the criteria are not very clear. If it isn't, if it's something to do with, again, something that seems to be on the edge of affect, but not directly related to a process, tedious. Problem with that is, I've then making the distinction between it's boring, in fact, it's tedious, quality. It's not everybody would agree with, but I'm going on the grammar. So I use that to make that distinction. Valuation tends to be whatever doesn't fit into any of the other categories. And you don't find that admitted, but Peter White has sort of said, yes, that's right, to me personally. I'm not allowed to say that in public, but valuation is quite a broad category, and very often that is the category that will get subdivided for different fields, for different areas of evaluation. Okay, any questions on that? I tend to forget them. Right, let's just go on very quickly to one small point there. It's worth remembering, modality and attitude are quite closely related. We'll come back to modality later when we look at engagement. But one way in which they're different, and notice they do share quite a lot of grammar. They're both to do with the speaker's stance. Can't use attitude because we're already using attitude for evaluation. The speaker's stance towards something. Typically, modality is to do with propositions or proposals. So if I say, it's likely that it will rain, it's likely that it's raining, yes, it's likely that it's raining, I'm telling you it's raining, and my attitude is it's likely. It may be raining is the same. So I have a proposition, it raining, and I tell you, for whatever reason, maybe 50-50. Remember again, modality is not typically just my stance, it's negotiating, but I'm not going to go into that today. Sometimes entities can be subject to modality. But typically, actually, there's a varied proposition. So if you say, for example, his possible illness is not an excuse. So basically you're evaluating the illness as possible. But you could argue that actually what you're saying is maybe he's ill. But I'm squashing it into a nominal group. So modality typically is to do with propositions or proposals. Proposals, remember, have to do with offers and commands. So he must go. He go, evaluating the degree of obligation. As we've seen, appraisal is typically entities. Grammatically, it will typically be nominal groups that are being evaluated. He, it. But occasionally, as we saw one example, it can be a proposition. It's great to be in London again. So as a proposition, someone is in London, and that's evaluated as great. Notice it uses the same structure as modality. It's likely that he's in London, it's great that he's in London. So they use the same structures. But on the whole, appraisal we'll find is we're talking about things and people. Modality, we're talking about ideas. Okay? Now, let's go back to that idea of inscribe and vote. And these are, actually I've slightly simplified Martin White because I find they've got too many categories. But inscribed, if we say this dish is awful, basically that's clearly negative evaluation. It doesn't tell us very much about what kind of quality, we just say bad. So we have terms in English, in any language, which are just positive or negative. Wonderful, good, bad, awful, horrible. They tell us how you feel, what your attitude is. They don't tell us very much about why. If I say this dish is tasteless, equally evaluative, but I've kind of narrowed the field a little. So tasteless, I can't really say, this building, well, I could just about, tasteless, but it means something different. But basically, what I'm doing is talking about the way, what it's like to put in your mouth. It's tasteless. Whereas awful doesn't even tell us that. Those would both be inscribed. So we can have more or less experiential content in an evaluative term. A word like awful has very little experiential content. It just says, I don't like it. It's tasteless has experiential plus evaluative. Everybody knows when you want to say experiential, yeah? To do with the content, the thing. I say this dish is a bit too Italian. Italian is not normally good or bad. For most people. Okay? But too. A bit so there's a signal there, not in the adjective, but in the grammar, signalling, this is above the norm, and basically it means I don't like it. I don't like Italian food. Notice already, if I say it's tasteless, you may disagree. You may say, no, it's lovely. But you can't, it's obvious that what I'm saying is talking about the taste. Italian, to get to Italian, maybe normally you think things Italian are good. But the speaker here is kind of projecting onto you acceptance of the idea that in this case being Italian is bad, through the grammar. You may disagree again, just as you don't have to agree it's tasteless or it's awful. But the grammar is projecting onto you a stance, a position, where being Italian is not good. You can reject it, but the language projects it onto you. This dish is high in fat content. High in, also, notice it's comparative, like to. High in means more than usual. But it can be positive or negative. High in vitamins, good. High in fat content, bad. So it signals some evaluation is going on, but you have to make sense of whether it's positive or negative. For our culture, for 21st century culture, fat content is bad. I always remember being in China and people saying, in a term of praise, you're fat. In China, this has changed now, but when I was there, just not long after the Cultural Revolution, being fat meant you had enough food. So it's a term, a positive term. Don't try, even then, don't try doing that to any British women especially. Well, fat is not weak, and having fat in it is not good. Now, in other cultures, in other times, my grandmother used to eat the fat off the meat because it was tasty. For her, and she lived to 83, so it didn't do her any harm, but for her, that was fine. For us kids, already we were moving into a different culture, different social setup. Eating, the fat was not so nice, and later it was dangerous for your health. But even that's more recent. So these things change. This dish has 2,000 calories. Now I've tried this, I don't know. I'm going to ask the men in the audience what that means. The women? Yes. Women know how many calories a dish has and how many calories you've got. On the whole, So to understand that, you probably have to be a Western woman. Western men, on the whole, don't think about calories. We just get fat because it's for women in our culture. They've got to look beautiful. We've just got to be rich. I'm exaggerating. But basically, many people would take that as a negative. But notice, has 2,000 calories is completely neutral. It's just telling you a fact. You can argue with, no, you're incorrect, it's got 2010. But basically, it's giving you a fact. But of course, why am I telling it to you? Because I want you to think, oh God, no, I'm not going to have that.
I want a sandwich.
Yes, exactly. 2000. Yes.
I think it has to do with the solidarity response that you want from your interlocutor.
Yes, exactly. Solidarity, bonding, and it will vary according to the other person. Some people will take peace solidarity, others will not know why you're telling them. And you often find this when you go into another culture. If you're reading text from another culture, you'll understand all the words. What you might miss is why they are telling you this. Because actually it is meant to make you think this is good or this is bad. But if you're not part of that culture, it passes you by. One that I like very much, and I think it works in most cultures, although even in China actually, where I thought it might not work, I had an example from online thing where someone's talking about her boyfriend. A woman's talking about her boyfriend. He's a nice guy. This is evaluation. But socks with sandals? Question mark. Does that have what does it mean to you? You say a man wears socks with sandals. It's terrible. It's a cultural, it's a fashion no, yeah? You don't do that. For men. Women with sandals and stockings, maybe? But certainly for men, this means a nerd, someone who's not well dressed. Okay? It doesn't tell you that, it just says socks with sandals. What it then relies on is the solidarity. You will understand what reaction I am trying to get from you. One way of looking at this, this is using Mike Jordan. He talks about assessment and basis. Basis, the reason for our assessment. So very often when we give an assessment, we give the basis. We tell the other person why we like it. I thought that film was great because invoked, afforded appraisal, I give you the basis and I expect you to do the evaluation. That's why I said it's coercive. It means you need to do the work. You need to understand why I'm telling you. And it can work even if you don't agree. When you're reading a text, in order to make sense of the text, you actually have to, at some level, accept the evaluation. Otherwise the text is incoherent. So if you read, he's a nice guy, but socks with sandals, either you don't understand it, or you see, okay, this person wants me to accept this is not good. Maybe you do accept that it's not good. Maybe your boyfriend always wears socks with sandals and you don't mind. Or maybe you wear socks with sandals and you don't mind. But the text puts you in the position of someone who sees that that is bad. So in that way, it is coercive. It's getting under your skin, as it were. If it's inscribed, yes, it's inviting you to agree. And you could disagree, but it's there, you're invited to give us back and say, or at least to respond, even disagreement. if it's invoked, especially forwarded, it's actually much more difficult in a way to attack. You can't say, no it doesn't. Okay? And you can say, this dish is awful. No it isn't. It's fine. This dish has 2,000 calories. No it doesn't. Well, yes it does, that's a fact. But you have to say something like, yeah, but I don't think that's so important. You have to actually bring to the surface, in order to disagree, you have to bring to the surface the evaluation that that's being projected onto you. So that kind of evaluation is more difficult to identify in text. As you're reading text, you'll often be thinking, is this evaluative? Mostly I would say the answer is yes. We typically re-evaluate all the time, but it's difficult to evaluate, to identify as an analyst, but it's actually probably the more important part of the text. Fortunately, what you'll often find is that in texts there will typically be inscribed evaluation and supporting invoked. So it's not just on its own. It's there, but it's supporting what is being said explicitly. But it's why, first of all, why this model is, I think, so productive, so valuable, but it's also why it's so critical. Okay, I think that's time for us to have a break. Is that right? Yes, it's an hour and a half. Sorry? Oh, 10, okay, fine, good. So that's fine, I believe. I wasn't quite sure. Yeah, right. Okay, let's move on. I've had trouble getting onto my internet, so I couldn't check the exact time. Okay, let's have a look at some of the problems. I've already raised some of these. What I'm hoping to do is both, as it were, convince you, persuade you probably don't need much persuading, that this is a fascinating area of discourse to look at, and also to frighten you, that it is very difficult. And you'll find disagreement. There are ways of reducing, but it's still going to be difficult. Okay. One thing I find quite useful to think about is distinction between ascribed value, so the value that's given to it, I think, and the appraised entity. Appraised entity is often called the target. I'm basing this on work from an ex-PhD student of mine way back, I think it's Taylor, who looked actually at academic scientific text. So, ascribed value. Which of the categories that I had in that table is being drawn? But if you go back to the origin, Martin White, how are the different categories described, particularly three major: affect, judgment, appreciation. Affect is to do with feeling, okay, but judgment is to do with ethical of people. Appreciation, aesthetic of things of different kinds. So we've got already, there are 2 points in each criterion. There's what's being evaluated and how it's being evaluated. And on being human, one of the things that we do is language is ours. Language is not out there, somehow put into our brains at birth, and we have no control over it. So Chomsky is completely wrong. By the way, sorry, a little side track. Have you seen recently, Chomsky is now arguing that language evolved for thought, for thinking. Thought, in order to, not for communication. Because his way of looking at it, he's very logical. That's where his kind of linguistics takes you. That language has not evolved for communication. It's evolved in the vein for thought. Okay, so he's pretty wrong. Anyway, to go back to this. What happens when, again, sorry, this is one of my old jokes, in some approaches, including people who, as it were, accept autonomous syntax, people working in that area still need to look at what happens. You know, things like, can you pass the sword? And this is then dealt with pragmatics. Pragmatics, I think, is the study of the funny things that happen to language when people start using it. So language is there, people come along and ruin it. No, it is ours. You know, language comes from us. And we're human. We're not computers, we're not machines. So what do? We have language, we play with it, we use it. Things go wrong, if you like. They're not wrong. They're simply, we have a tool for communication and we use it in as many ways as we can. So we have this nice, neat, three-continent world of evaluation, and we start playing around with it. Great for humans, great for us as users, because it means we can say more things, we can express more delicate feelings. For analysts, it's hell, because it means all kinds of things I'm not sure what to do with. So, as I said, if we think of, we've got, he's completely immoral. Okay? He is a person, immoral is clearly judging. Okay? Morality is to do with human behavior. This book is immoral. A book is a failure. Yes, let's find one. Yes. Yes. Yes, that's the other reaction. But basically, we've got a thing being evaluated with a value which is associated with humans. Now, is it appreciation because it's not human? Or is it judgment because it's a judgment term? Okay. Again, Monica Bedrelek, who I think is something very interesting, suggests, say, it is appreciation, this is the book, using judgment language. Now, very often we can just say it's appreciation, I don't need to go any further. But if you're looking across a whole discourse, you may be able to say, a lot of this is this intermediate, it's appreciation with judging lexists. If it happens once, you probably don't need to pay much attention. If it happens more regularly across the discourse, maybe you set up an instantial category. Okay? An instantial category means, for this discourse, appreciation using judging lexis is important. And I find that happens all the time in texts. Sorry, to go slightly sideways, if I'm looking at tourist texts. Okay? Very often, what kind of thing you find the street runs from the lake to the radio tower. technical, what is that? Is that material process, intransitivity, or is it relational? But clearly what it's telling us is, it's not telling us the road bumps. It says it's between. So it's locational, relational process, but with material nexus. And again, if you look at tourist brochures, you will often find that that combination is important. In other types of text, it may not appear. They just get very clearly, this is material, this is relational. But in that kind of text, that instantial, relational expressed with material lexis is important. So in this same kind of thing, if you find in my discourse that quite often I have something where I think it's a thing, but the lexis seems to be judgment, then you say, okay, that's appreciation with judging lexis. If I find it quite often, it's probably a characteristic of that kind of discourse. And it will be something which distinguishes that register from other registers. Similarly, this beautifully proportioned side-wide sideboard is simply studied. All these are taken from YouTube. Beautifully proportioned, but, sorry, start with sideboard is clearly non-human. You know what sideboard is? It's in the dining room. It's not the table, the kind of cupboard where you keep plates and things, a sideboard. It's where you put your food when you had rich people. You put your food there, they would help themselves and then go to the table, to the sideboard. So it's beautifully proportioned. Clearly appreciation, balance, and this beautifully proportioned with long tapering legs. And then Lashvili is a bravura dancer. So he is a man, but he's beautifully proportioned. And it's clearly we're judging him, but it's with appreciation lexis. You can't, because what do you say? Beautifully proportioned. Well, you could say, well, it's judgment. I suppose it's normality, sort of, but more important, I think it is slightly unusual lexis to talk about a person. Again, that may only be one example in your discourse. Then you say, okay, I just call it judgment. I'm not quite sure which category, but I call it judgment. But if you found several of them across your text, then you might be saying, okay, I need an instantial category. This is judgment with appreciation lexis. So there are ways of doing it, but it can be tricky. One other way of thinking about it, I put on the table, okay, if you have ethical values with human entities, then it's judgment, that's not a problem. If you have ethical values with non-human, then typically it's going to be evaluation, subcategory valuation. Not always, but very often. So immoral, I would actually, if I had to put it into an appreciation category, I would say it's valuation with, in this case, with judgment lexis. Similarly, aesthetic values, non-human entities, typically it's appreciation. That's it. If you have aesthetic values of human, which is beautifully proportioned, then typically it's capacity. So again, not always. And another issue, this is one of my favourites, really, where do you stop? This is what I call the Russian doll problem. You know Russian dolls, when you unscrew one and there's another one in there which is gone. This is almost the opposite. You start from inside, you don't know when to stop adding gold. So, this was something from, her data. We offer superior magnetic screening with the minimum of outgassing. This was in a letter written as if personal to someone receiving a brochure from a company. It was in the covering letter. Now, very clearly, we've got superior, which just superior is one of these general words, just means very good. So it could be anything. That's superior magnetic screening. So the appraised entity, the target is magnetic screening. It has ascribed values inscribed, appreciation, no problem, with the minimum of outgassing, with the minimum of, again, there's this idea of a norm, and this has got less. And outgassing presumably is bad. I have no idea what it is, it sounds rude, but it's presumably bad. It has the minimum, which means I'm telling you something which is meant to make you think good. So it's supporting, it's provoked appreciation. Fine, no problem. But is that what? Why am I being told this? Am I just meant to think that is good magnetic screening? You can say yes, that's where I stop. I've got the inside gone. But we offer this. So we is the company, the institution P, treated as a person because we offer good things. So isn't that judgment of us? So invoked judgment, we are told something which is meant to make us think better of the company, like this. So which do we take? Indicating one, in the sense they're both correct. And essentially, people working with appraisal fall into two camps. One extreme, actually won't mind, okay. Questions about attitude. The model we've looked at so far. Because if not, I'm going to get you to do some work. Everybody happy? Okay. Right. If you've seen the handouts, you will see that I've got two texts. I don't know if you know the way he looks. Here on both sides. Anyone seen the film? I haven't. It just happened that it was, when I was preparing for this, I noticed it was online. It's going to be Brazil's Oscar, the submission for Oscar, the Oscar best film. And what I've got are reviews. A review from an English website and from a Portuguese or a Brazilian website. Okay. Now, I don't know if you have these, if you managed to download them. If not, you can just leave that in there. That will all be on, of may have to reduce. Okay. Film reviews are an obvious sight. Their function is to evaluate. What I'd like to look at is how they go about it. Okay, so, now I'm an SFL, I'm an English language teacher. I want you to work in pairs or threes and analyse that text, the evaluation in that text. Okay? So decide where is the evaluation, what are the evaluative expressions, what's being evaluated, which category is being evaluated, and that's as it were the mechanical bit, but not very mechanical. After that we'll think about what does this tell us about how people go about this kind of evaluation in our culture, and then I hope we'll have time, or we'll have to have time to look at the Brazilian, the Portuguese text and see if we can identify any differences or any similarities. And I'm quite happy to answer questions as you're working. Where do you find appraisals? Sorry? Where do you find appraisals in that text? Yeah, but where first? Fresh, a fresh perspective. Okay, let's fresh perspective. Anything else before that? Familiar.
Familiar, growing.
Familiar, yeah. Growing pains. Yes, I mean, I'm thinking just potential. Right, so growing pains of adolescence. It's clearly to do with something negative. Familiar, that growing pains is, in a sense, it's not doesn't seem to be to do with you and me, the writer or the reader. Familiar. Well, no. Yeah. Yeah, something experience that we've all had. So something is familiar. Yes, I think actually it's on the borderline. Well known, yeah. And well known, of course, brings out the idea that it's evaluative. So there's something which is familiar. Familiar to whom? To the reader, to everyone, yes, including the reader. So the growing pains of adolescence are evaluated in passing, notice, because this is within the nominal group. It's not they are familiar to everybody, but so it's kind of almost smuggled in. Something which we all know, it's evaluated as, so first of all, what kind, what category? Appreciation or judgment? What is being evaluated? Yeah, but growing pains, it's a thing.
It's a thing, so it's appreciation.
So, no, it's appreciation.
Appreciation is the thing.
For me, it's appreciation because it's a thing that is being evaluated. You're right, it's something which happens to humans, pains, but grammatically, it's a thing. Familiar means it's unsurprisingly something we all know about. Okay? So we may have to separate. One thing I think familiar there is appreciation. Has to be what? Valuation, that general category. But why has the writer used it? What happens? What's it implying? But that it's horrible, but we all know about it. So in passing, the writer is projecting onto the reader one set of values, a value about one thing. We all know about this. Okay, this is something that is known. So we share the values. Okay? So even in that little bit, the writer is already very quietly, as it were, setting up a shared world of values. We know about these growing pains. That's part of our culture. In some cultures, growing pains do not exist as a concept. Some cultures, they simply wouldn't, it wouldn't make sense. I assume in Brazilian culture it is a familiar concept. But by labelling it familiar, because he could have left it out. Why do you think he needs to establish it? In other words, why did this writer use the word familiar?
I think to catch the attention and to motivate the reader. Because we're going to film about something that is common. All the problems with adolescents and make you want to...
Make you want to go on, yes. So it is interactive. Notice he could have left it out. The growing pains of adolescence. That's then not specifically represented as something we all share, something we all... So already he's beginning to set up common ground, bonding or solidarity. Okay, are captured from a fresh perspective in the way he looks. Fresh perspective. But what is the... certainly the perspective is fresh. So that must be appreciation. Fresh. But what is being evaluated at this point? In other words, what am I, the writer, negotiating? Is it the perspective? Yeah, it's actually the film which captures from a fresh perspective. So already we've got a very simple case of fresh perspective captured from a fresh perspective. It's the film. I think I would want, in this case, I would almost overlook fresh perspective and say this is an appreciation of the film. Notice it's an invoked appreciation. Or you could say provoked, because very often when you have an evaluation, explicit, fresh perspective, but which is part of a bigger one, that provokes, more than just evoking, it's kind of pushing you towards saying, okay, this is a good film. I think this is a good film. Okay? So I think I want to pick up, if I was doing this analysis, I want to pick up on familiar because I think it's doing something special. But then the fresh, I would say, that's actually part of the evaluation of the film. But notice also two different things. Familiar is going out into the world. Fresh perspective is the film. So there's a kind of move from general world to this particular film. But the focus, of course, is on the particular film. The familiar is kind of done in passing. Where evaluation comes may be important. It can be predictive, it is familiar, but it can often be buried in a sense, not buried, but put in as part of the nominal group, not the focus, but it's still doing the work. Okay, what do we get next?